Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about a first-of-its-kind study about lifestyle diseases like diabetes and hypertension in the country. We also talk about the cyclone Biparjoy, which is headed for the coast of Gujarat. But first, we talk about the Reserve Bank of India. Last Thursday, the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee was to announce its latest decision regarding its policies and the repo rate, which is essentially the rate at which the RBI lends money to the banks. And this rate is supposed to control inflation, the general price rise in the country. To reduce inflation, the repo rate could be increased, because that way you make the banks borrow less money and invariably make people borrow less money. And so they spend less, the demand goes down, and so does inflation. And you could also do the reverse, which is to decrease the repo rate to increase demand. And so the question was, what would the RBI do this time? And we'll let Indian Express's Udit Misra tell us what the RBI did.
So, it was widely expected what RBI did, which was to stay put. In technical terms, it's called the policy has been of status quo, of maintaining the status quo, which is to say that typically when the Monetary Policy Committee sits, it can tweak the repo rate. It decided not to tweak the repo rate. It stays at 6.5%. And secondly, it did not even change its stance, a policy stance. A policy stance is supposed to give an indication of what is the RBI trying to do. So it stayed the way it had been in the previous policy and nothing basically changed.
And Udit, what does it mean when the RBI decides not to change its policy stance, not to change its repo rate? Does the RBI feel that things are going just right, that nothing needs to change right now?
So, first of all, for last 2-3 year period, I think most listeners would recall that the RBI has had a very terrible time. We've had very high inflation. We've had COVID contraction. So RBI has been sort of trying to deal with many things. Essentially, the RBI's job is to maintain the economy at a right temperature. It should continue growing, but it should neither get overheated, which means too much inflation is there, nor should it totally cool down so that, there's not enough activity.
Right, they try to maintain the inflation at about 4%.
Yes. So the metric that they use to get this right temperature is a retail inflation rate of 4%. They believe that if the economy is growing at a rate in such a manner that the inflation rate is at 4%, then, everything is sort of sorted. And they also look at growth rates and they should be anywhere above 6 or 7%. And after a very long time, the economy looks like in a state where inflation pressures have abated. And in terms of growth, there are positive surprises. As many listeners would recall, just last week, we got to know that India's economy grew at 7.2% in the last financial year, which ended in March, as against the expectation of 7%. So a slight positive surprise. And even in the RBI policy, the RBI said that it was expecting slightly higher growth in the first 2 quarters. So, inflation is in control, growth is chugging along fine, and it looks like a moment where why fix it when it's not broken kind of a scenario. So RBI has chosen to just wait and watch.
And you mentioned that the latest GDP figures were slightly higher than what the RBI was expecting. Have there been other indicators as well that are giving us positive signs about the economy?
Yes. So apart from GDP, which is sort of put together after the data comes through and several revisions, there are early indicators, of what is happening to urban demand, how many cars are being sold and all of that. So RBI seems very optimistic about how those demand parameters are churning out. RBI also conducts these regular surveys where they check with consumers, how's their sentiment. They check with households, what are, their inflation expectations. And both those parameters are showing that consumer sentiment has improved over the last survey and inflation expectations have fallen. So overall, it looks like a scenario where, if there is a normal monsoon, then possibly the economy will be in a safe zone where inflation is coming down and growth is robust.
Okay, so right now this seems like a fair bit of good news for an economy that for a while had not been doing well, right? So what are the things that experts say that we should be looking out for now and what the RBI should be careful about?
Yeah, so at one level, one thing has to be understood that this relative moment of calm in the economy where things are looking good is in a relative sense. We are seeing it in a context of the COVID downturn and the inflationary surge that we saw with the war in Ukraine, and also in perspective of 3 years of growth deceleration prior to COVID. It is in that context that economy seems like in a decent shape. But there are many other metrics. For example, just the fact that we'll be growing at around 6.5. I mean, most professional forecasters actually peg the economy to be growing at 6%. RBI is far more optimistic that it'll grow at 6.5%. So even that 6.5% growth rate is actually not a high growth rate for India. For us, more often than not, you would hear we desiring to grow at, 8 or 9%, right? So 6.5 is still limited.
Right. So we are doing better, but only in comparison to what we were experiencing.
Exactly. First of all, it's a relative calm that we are experiencing. And then on top of that, there are many winds blowing, which could push the economy back. For example, monsoon is a massive factor. And now the phenomena called El Nino could, disrupt that. If it leads to lower production, if it leads to lower incomes, then the economy may not grow as fast as RBI would want. Similarly, at the same time, while it is not growing fast, prices might increase. So both the metrics will get upset. But there are other factors, as even the GDP data showed, that the biggest contributor to India's GDP is the consumption expenditure that you and I make. Money that we spend in our personal capacity, right? And that engine of growth is fairly weak. That amount of money is growing at a very feeble pace.
You mean people like you and me, they're not spending enough, they're not buying enough goods?
Exactly. So, GDP can grow because the government builds a bridge or a company buys a new factory, lays down a new factory. Or it could grow because of, you and I going out to have a gala time, buying an ice cream, watching a movie. Now, what we do is actually, contributes around 55 to 60% of India's GDP. And that engine is growing at just about 2.5% as of last 2 quarters. So which means that while the economy overall is growing at over 7%, the biggest engine is actually faltering. So that is a big concern for many economists that, if this big engine continues to falter, then there is no way you can sustain high growth rates. And we are seeing in the last 3 years itself that we grew at 9% in 21-22, then 7.2% in 22-23. And for the current financial year, we are expecting to grow at anywhere between 6 to 6.5. So you're seeing a deceleration again happening. And that is because private consumption stays fairly weak even now.
And Udit, what is the reason that people are not spending enough? Have incomes not risen since the pandemic?
Yes. So, expenditure would be a factor of incomes, and incomes themselves would be a factor of employment. How many people have jobs, what kind of jobs they are, what kind of wage rate growth they have seen. And if you look at the granular data, to whatever extent we have the access to it, it shows that, those things are struggling to grow. And there is also an, psychological element. Often when people go through massive crisis like a COVID pandemic or whatever, the framework also changes. You tend to then want to save a bit more because there might come a crisis because you've just gone through one. So all those factors might be there. So there was a pent-up demand during coming out of the COVID phase where people spent a lot. But most economists now believe that that pent-up demand is gone. If you wanted to take a vacation, you've taken that. And now you're back to saving mode and you're back to looking at the daily expenses and you're finding that the economics is not working and you're holding back your consumption levels. And when you do that at an aggregate level, then it sort of also slows down the economy.
And next we talk about diabetes. Recently, one of the biggest and most representative studies was conducted to find out more about the prevalence of non-communicable diseases in the country. This study was spearheaded by Dr. Mohan's Diabetes Specialty Center with the help of the Indian Council of Medical Research. And it found that India has a very high prevalence of lifestyle-related diseases like diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, and hypertension. And more importantly, the study, which was conducted over nearly a decade, also showed that India's cases of diabetes are likely going to increase, especially in rural areas. In this segment, my colleague Rahel Philipose speaks to Indian Express's Anonna Dutt about the findings of the study and the status of diabetes in India.
So, Anonna, to begin with, walk us through some of the biggest findings of the study.
So the study says that 11.4% of our population, which is about 101 million people, are living with diabetes in the country at present. More importantly, there are 15.3% people, or 136 million, who are living with pre-diabetes. Now, pre-diabetes is a stage where you can convert to diabetes or you can come back depending on your lifestyle habits. So this is a population in which intervention is very effective. If they change their diet and lifestyle, lose a few kgs, then it is possible that we bring them back to normal rather than then going on to become diabetics. So India's people with this Asian Indian phenotype have a affinity towards moving on to diabetes instead of moving back. We have a very, very fast conversion with about 50% people going on to become diabetics in the next few years.
Right. And Anonna, one of the lead authors of the study, described the rising number of diabetes and pre-diabetes cases in India as a ticking time bomb. Could you talk a bit about why that's the case and the biggest concerns for India in that regard?
So the thing is, we already have 101 million people living with diabetes, and we know that diabetes predisposes you to several other conditions like cardiac diseases, increases your risk of stroke, it will increase your risk of kidney disease, it will increase the risk of several other conditions. Diabetics are also likely to have worse outcomes when there is an infection, which is what we saw with COVID. Now, we already have 101 million diabetics, and there are 136 million more people who are just waiting and over the, next 5 years or so, might convert into diabetes. So that is why our experts said that this is a ticking time bomb. But the good thing is this time bomb can be diffused, and it doesn't take much. The very important thing when we talk about diabetes or hypertension, obesity, high levels of cholesterol, the interventions are all the same. People have to change their lifestyle habits. Eating junk food is a strict no-no. That is one of the reasons why we have such high, levels of non-communicable diseases, but also because we tend to have a lot of carbohydrates in our normal meal as well. We are very rice or roti heavy population. We have to reduce that from our diet as well. Then regular exercise, better sleep, no smoking, no drinking alcohol, all of these things help. Other than that, the study has also shown us that this population of pre-diabetics, this is in places where the diabetes levels at the moment are lower. It is in cities which have fewer people with diabetics, also in rural areas that has a lower prevalence of diabetes at the moment. What this means is that in the next few years, these are the places where we are likely to see a huge increase in diabetes. And with fewer facilities available in rural India, this could be a huge problem. So that is why the experts have said this is the time to intervene. We know now there is a huge population that might become diabetic, and that will increase all the other disease burdens. So we should intervene now.
Okay, and the study didn't just talk about diabetes. It also mentioned other lifestyle and metabolic conditions, right? Like obesity. What does the study say about these conditions, and how are they linked to diabetes?
So other than diabetes, obesity is again a big problem because just like diabetes, it affects several other conditions. Obesity increases the risk of diabetes. It increases the risk of hypertension. It increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases. It increases the risk of stroke. Now, the study has found that 39.5%, almost 40% of the population, or 351 million people, have abdominal obesity. So, usually when we look at obesity, we measure it according to the BMI or body mass index, which is a ratio of the height and the weight. But in Indian population, again, we have seen that someone with a normal BMI may also have a lot of abdominal obesity or central obesity. obesity, which is known to still increase the risk of diabetes and hypertension, etc. So even if their BMI is low, their risk could be high, which is why the study not only looked at this BMI based obesity, but also just obesity around the abdomen. And that is the measure that we were referring to right now.
Right. So then belly fat would be a good indicator. But talking more about the study, it's being described as the best representative estimate of lifestyle diseases in India. So could you talk about that and what makes the study so reliable?
So this is a fantastic one-of-a-kind study. The study was spearheaded by the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation and supported by the Indian Council of Medical Research. And instead of, say, picking random samples from a couple of cities in the north, some in west, some in east, some in south, the researchers actually picked up samples of 1.13 lakh people from every state in India. So if we look at the demographic divide of this study, the people that they surveyed, it matches exactly to our census data, which means it is completely representative of our population, which is why it is such a reliable study. And if we look internationally as well, no other country so far has ever done a study where samples have been taken from each and every state in their country.
Okay, and do the findings of the study align with what we already know about these metabolic diseases in the country?
So specifically when we talk about diabetes, the last estimates that we had before this study came out was a WHO estimate saying that there are 77 million diabetics in India. Now, if you talk to Dr. Mohan, who sort of spearheaded this study, even at the time when WHO gave this 77 million estimate, it seemed a little low to them. Why is that? This is because the estimates are based on a previous study, again done by the same group in DIAB. And so it was some 7-8 states that were studied, and a lot of them were in the northeast of the country, which sort of skewed the perception that, there is a lower prevalence in India, whereas it's not true. If you include more states from the south, the prevalence will go up. So now, based on this holistic data from all the states, the estimate that they have arrived at is 101 million. But of course, what we have seen for all of these non-communicable diseases is that the rate is going up, and that is what we've seen in other studies as well.
And Anonna, what do experts say is behind the changing trends that we're seeing in these diseases?
So the simple answer is lifestyle. And that is why we do see a higher prevalence of diabetes and hypertension, say in cities which are the economic hubs, say for example, Bangalore, where there's a boom of IT companies. There are people living with more disposable income who are going out and eating, who are drinking, who are smoking. All of this adds up to the risk of these conditions. Other than that, we are stressed out. We are not sleeping properly. Most of our jobs are sitting in front of a computer. We are not doing exercise regularly. All of this have come together to increase the burden. And right now, of course, yes, it is higher in cities than in rural areas, but rural areas are catching up.
And in the end, we talk about Cyclone Biparjoy, which has developed into an extremely severe cyclonic storm and is expected to make landfall along the Gujarat coast on Thursday. The cyclone was earlier supposed to move towards north and northwest and make landfall in Pakistan, but it changed course over the weekend. This is the first time in 25 years that Gujarat will witness a cyclone, which has raised concerns among the people in the state and the administration. In fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah held a high-level meeting with the central and state government agencies yesterday to review their preparedness. To know more about the situation, my colleague Utsa Sarmin speaks to Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha.
Amitabh, can you tell us the kind of impact an extremely severe cyclone like Biparjoy can have? What can we expect when it makes landfall?
Right. So, extremely severe cyclonic storm is officially one category of cyclones. Now, the India Met Department has categorized different kinds of cyclones depending on their strength, and extremely severe cyclonic storm is actually the second highest category. And most of these category is on the basis of the associated wind speed, how fast the winds around it is moving, also the kind of force that it is generating. So Biparjoy is generating wind speeds roughly in the range of 125 to 150 kilometers per hour, sometimes faster than that. And that kind of wind can be extremely destructive. So that's what is headed for Gujarat as of now.
And you have written that it may lose some of its strength before making landfall. So will that reduce its impact as well?
Yes, but only on a very minor level. So by the time it reaches the land, it is supposed to lose some of its energy. So from an extremely severe cyclonic storm, it is likely to get downgraded to a very severe cyclonic storm, but it would still be a very, very powerful cyclone. And the warnings that have been issued by the Met Department clearly say that you can expect very high storm surges, which are say 2 to 3 meters in height. Then you can expect floodings in most of the coastal areas, especially low-lying areas are going to be flooded badly. The wind speeds are powerful enough to completely destroy all sorts of kacha houses, mud houses. Those kind of houses in the coastal districts probably can potentially be destroyed completely. Pakka houses can also be damaged. The roads can be damaged. Your power lines, transmission lines are likely to get snapped. Then your standing crops, your fields, I think those are the kind of things that will get completely damaged. And buildings can be damaged as well. So all sorts of infrastructure that is near the coast, those are actually in real danger.
Right, and now Gujarat hasn't seen a cyclone in 25 years. Does that raise concerns about the state's preparedness?
Right. So India has witnesses cyclones on both sides of its coastline, on the eastern side in the Bay of Bengal as well as on the western side, which is the Arabian Sea. Now, as all of us know, the Bay of Bengal side generates cyclones much more frequently than the Arabian Sea side. So obviously the Gujarat coast is not used to getting cyclones as frequently as say Odisha or coastal Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal. But the fact is that India's cyclone preparedness is along the entire coastline, east and west. The southern part of the Indian coastline, they also do not get cyclones very frequently, but they are part of the preparedness plan that has been done in the last 1 decade or so, and Gujarat is very much part of it because the Arabian Sea cyclones, when they happen and when they come to the Indian coastline, they invariably come near the Gujarat coast. So Gujarat is quite vulnerable when it comes to the Arabian Sea cyclones. So, preparedness, it's not as if Gujarat is completely, has not experienced cyclones of this kind. It has, and there are elaborate preparations that are done.
And what do experts say about the kind of measures the state and central government need to take right now so that the cyclone's impact is minimal?
See, the most important part, of course, involves the evacuation of vulnerable populations. So the first priority, of course, is to minimize the loss of life. Then they minimize loss of life of cattle. So now all the shelters also have, provisions to accommodate cattle as well. So once the life part is taken care of, then the third part comes, how to minimize the damage to infrastructure along this. So your power lines, for example, railway stations, airports. We often see that happening when powerful cyclones hit the Odisha coast, for example. We often see many of the cities get flooded for several days. Trains stop functioning, power goes off, you have airports shut down completely. So that kind of infrastructure, and it actually creates a lot of problems in even ensuring relief and rescue efforts. So the third part of the entire preparedness is about minimizing the loss to critical infrastructure. The idea is to have your basic infrastructure working and moving so that your power lines must be resilient to these kind of cyclones. Your airports and your railways must be moving. Your road infrastructure must be intact so that even for carrying out rescue operations, relief operations, you need to have these things in place. So that's the important part, and that's where a lot of work still needs to be done. More or less on saving life, reducing the fatalities, both in terms of human lives as well as cattle. That has seen in the last 10 years or so, the number of lives lost in cyclones has gone down drastically. So there has been a lot of progress on that area. The next level, of course, is to minimize damage to critical infrastructure.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, with help from Utsa, Sarmin, Rahel, Philipose, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.